in the series of our instruction section management series. Amanda Folk is actually going to do the introduction for this one, and I will be monitoring the chat, from what I understand.
Hi everyone, this is Amanda Folk. Thank you, Ashley, for kicking us off, and thank you everyone for being here. I'd like to thank Sarah Miller and Amanda Hess for agreeing to be part of our discussion forum today. And before I start with their bios, I would like to give a special thank you to Lois Sharp from ACRL for working with our committee to get this discussion forum off the ground, including setting up practice presentations and helping with the actual day of event. So thank you very much, Lois. We appreciate your help with this. What I'm going to do, and for those of you, just to be sure you're at the right place, today's discussion forum is called Using the Framework to Foster Conversations about Information Literacy Instruction. And we have two speakers today. Sarah Miller will be our first speaker. She is the librarian for interdisciplinary teaching and learning initiatives at Michigan State University. She supports and facilitates the development of Michigan State teacher librarians and pursuing information literacy-related participation in campus initiatives. Sarah works with first-year writing students in the information literacy classroom and has previously served as Michigan State's head of information literacy. She's co-facilitated faculty learning communities focusing on writing and inquiry within the disciplines, and worked with the university committee on liberal learning in the development of Michigan State's undergraduate learning goals rubrics. Sarah has published and presented internationally with librarians and disciplinary faculty on the intersections of writing, rhetoric, and information literacy. Her current research focuses on critical pedagogy and practice. After Sarah's presentation, we'll hear from Amanda Hess. Amanda is the e-learning, instructional technology, and education librarian at Oakland University Libraries. In this role, she works with her colleagues to develop the library's diverse and user-focused online learning offerings. Amanda is also responsible for delivering professional learning offerings aimed at building librarians' capacity to integrate instructional design and technology into information literacy instruction. Amanda is the liaison librarian to Oakland University School of Education and Human Services, where she maintains an active teaching presence. Her research focuses on information literacy instruction, instructional design and technology, and the intersection of these practices into faculty development. She has shared her research on these ideas at ACRL and in journals including Portal, College and Research Libraries, and the Journal of Academic Librarianship. So thank you both, Amanda and Sarah, for agreeing to join us today. And I will let both of you get started. I think we'll have both of our presenters present, and then we'll open it up for discussion and questions, which again, Ashley will be monitoring. Thank you.
Thank you. So this is Sarah Miller, and do I need the ball here? Sorry, this is my very first webinar, so I'm excited to present to you today. See if I can move that up there. Okay, I'm going to get started, and hopefully, I'm now the presenter. Excellent. Thank you, Lois. Okay, so welcome everyone. Today I'm going to be discussing a workshop developed for librarians and teaching faculty, which is structured around the ACRL framework. This workshop facilitates in-depth examination and analysis of information literacy within disciplines and provides a way to think and talk about the framework concepts in a setting outside of the library. I'll be mostly addressing the theory behind the workshop, but I will include some URLs at the end to access the workshop documents in case anyone is interested in following up with that. Since our webinar is focused on the value of information literacy, I wanted to address how this workshop highlights that value in two ways. First of all, the workshop draws on the value of librarian-specific expertise. This expertise both in the disciplinary knowledge that we have and in our perspectives and participation in wider campus conversations. The workshop also positions information literacy, and by extension its instruction, more firmly as an integrated part of a course or curriculum, which promotes its effectiveness and possibilities beyond one shot. So a little bit of a background of this workshop. The idea for the workshop came about as we were holding feedback sessions with librarians at Michigan State over the original drafts of the framework when those were being produced. One concern expressed by librarians was how to talk about the frames, both with other librarians and with teaching faculty. Many of the librarians were still grappling with what the concepts meant to them, both theoretically and practically, and were not sure how they would initiate discussion with their liaison faculty about the framework. They were also unsure of how the concepts represented in the frames would work out practically within their instruction and liaison responsibilities. One of the framework's strengths is how well the concepts work both within and across disciplines. The fact that the frames are both disciplinary and transdisciplinary means that the frames span all disciplines but are worked out very differently in each one. For example, scholarly conversation occurs in both history and biology, but it looks very different in each discipline. Viewing the frames in this way is also key in working toward more practical application and clearer collaboration with disciplinary faculty. Even if a librarian is a generalist, we often work with faculty who are disciplinary experts who are deeply embedded in their fields. Seen in this way, information literacy is part of the larger concept of disciplinary literacy, or the ability to function fluently as a participating, or reading, writing, and researching member of a discipline. Each field has specific ways of knowing not just how, but why information sources are integral to that field. This view is consistent with what we know about information literacy instruction, that it's most effective when it's contextual and when it's at a point of need. A key to identifying those effective places and points of need for information literacy instruction is by bringing tacit or unspoken disciplinary processes and understandings regarding information sources to light. As you can see here, tacit means understood or implied without being stated. When we consider ourselves as librarians or consider teaching faculty who are disciplinary experts, so many of our expert practices involving information sources are tacit, implied, assumed, or second nature to us, but not always specifically named when we're working with students. So what things are tacit in information literacy? Tacit understandings can be incredibly simple. They could be a procedural understanding, like the fact that researchers in a field use a certain database. They could also be ontological, like a knowledge of what categories of information exist in a field. An example of this would be an understanding of what constitutes a scholarly source in a specific field. These tacit ideas can also be very complex. For example, an epistemological understanding, which is how we know what we know. This could be an unspoken knowledge of how authority is constructed within a field. I also included affective understandings because often these questions and issues can invoke strong reactions which reflect disciplinary culture. We've all experienced reactions from both students and faculty, including frustration, fear, and anxiety related to knowledge or lack thereof regarding information sources and how they're used within a discipline. Returning to the idea of disciplinary literacy, in order to function at a level of expertise within a discipline, a person needs to have picked up these tacit understandings somehow, either consciously or unconsciously. Looking into what these approaches are and how they function requires some self-examination, reflection, and deconstruction of our own experiences. How did we learn these things ourselves? For example, how did we as librarians learn, or how are we still learning, about how scholarly conversation works in our field? This deconstruction process is the primary goal of the workshop that I'll be talking about in a bit more detail here in just a minute. This brings us to decoding the disciplines. Decoding the disciplines is a model developed by Indiana University that helps with the disciplinary deconstruction process in order to communicate disciplinary understandings better to students. It was created from a faculty development project at Indiana University Bloomington by groups looking to devise new ways to help students get past common obstacles to learning in their disciplines. Well, I'm not going to go into detail about this project today. It's definitely worth your time to take a look at the process, and I will also include the URL to Decoding the Disciplines at the end of this session. The main concept from Decoding the Disciplines that I've made use of in this workshop is the idea of bottlenecks. Bottlenecks can be huge clues to where tacit understanding is not being clearly communicated to students. These places can be where students are consistently having trouble with a concept or not meeting the instructor's expectations in some way. As librarians, we sometimes hear about these bottlenecks from course instructors. For example, unseen tacit practices and knowledge are often evidenced through gaps, frustrations, assumptions, and unmet expectations. I'm sure we've all heard a variation of some of these quotations at some point. Comments like this usually bother me because they subtly place blame on students for not meeting expectations that may not have been clearly communicated to them, if at all. However, these frustrations are real and can give us clues about the tacit expectations or practices that are not being met. When I hear something like this, I usually try and dig deeper to uncover the root underlying assumptions or expectations, which are those tacit ideas. This process can help instructors communicate more clearly, students to better understand these expectations, and librarians to better design approaches to instruction. Everyone wins when we fight the deficiency model in this way. Okay, on to the workshop. This workshop is most effective when done in a mixed group of librarians and teaching faculty. I've also done a version of the workshop with just librarians. I've had groups as large as 30 and as small as 6. The format is flexible. I have a set of questions, reflective questions, that I've both expanded and condensed to fit into 1 hour, 3 hour, and 5 hour time frames. The most important part of the format is to be sure to include time for individual reflection, small group discussion, and large group plenary discussion, or a time of reporting out. The workshop questions that I'll show here in just a minute focus on expert practice, but it's not required for librarians who are participating to be the experts in specific disciplinary information processes. It's the librarian's job really to help faculty parse out the information literacy concepts or the frames. When I've done this workshop with just librarians as an audience, some librarians had more advanced disciplinary expertise, and so they used that expertise, and then others answered these questions in the context of librarianship as their discipline. The main goal of the workshop is to identify areas of difficulty for students and to set the ground for ways to address them. So these next several slides, the first part of the workshop consists of the participants individually reflecting on a set of questions based on the frames. I've listed those questions out on the next several slides, so what I'm going to do is just give you a few moments to read these questions based on each frame as they come up, and then I'll forward the slide. So these are the questions based on scholarship as conversation. The next slide is the questions based on authority as constructed and contextual. And again, people are answering these questions within the context of their own discipline. So a psychologist would be thinking how rhetorical style, visuals, and text support authority construction in their own field. The next slide here are the questions based on research's inquiry. This is an interesting section because research, even the word research, means something different across disciplines, and that comes out a lot in discussions about research's inquiry. The next questions are based on information creation as a process. The key question in this set is about what counts as evidence in your discipline. So again, something that counts as evidence in the hard sciences is going to be very different than something that counts as evidence in something like a historical approach as well. And again, if you miss any of these questions, they're on the worksheet that I have a link to at the end here. So I know it's a lot to take in at once. The next frame, information has value. These are the questions I have for that frame. These questions are focused on the different ways that information has value, so not just as a proprietary information, financial value, or citation value, but value to you as a scholar, to others as a scholar as well. Searching as strategic exploration. This is a deceptively difficult one for people to answer, as sometimes people are not really that reflective of their own search processes, or they may not know what are some typical search behaviors among their colleagues. And it kind of gets people to thinking. Okay, again, I'm sorry if I went through those too fast, but again, there'll be a link to those at the end if you'd like to look at those more in depth. I want to move on to talking a little bit more about the workshop. As you can see, this is a lot to think about. I found that 30 minutes is a pretty good amount of time to give the participants to individually reflect and make notes in all these areas. After the participants finish the reflective piece, I asked them to sit in groups by discipline or broad disciplinary areas such as humanities, sciences, etc. It's important to have at least one librarian in each of these groups. And the next portion, the discussion questions, can also take about 30 minutes. These are the questions that I present for discussions in the small group after they've done the reflection on the specific frames. They move on to these questions here, talking about different themes that emerge that are unique to their discipline or group. Are there any crucial understandings or thresholds in their own disciplines that come up when they're talking about information sources or information literacy? I know that these can be unique to each discipline as well. The ways that scholars engage with information in their discipline is something that is also discussed pretty frequently, and then kind of bringing that to the teaching and learning aspect. So how is this actually taught to students? Does this happen in your field? Is it typical? Do you have typical assignments that embody looking at how scholars engage with information? And the other question I ask is if there are any disciplinary standards that they're aware of that address these questions. So as we know, some fields, I'm thinking nursing, engineering, have very specific disciplinary standards that talk about information literacy. The ones that talk about information literacy in specific ways, sometimes by thinking in this way, sometimes they can look at some other standards regarding their practices that are related to information literacy that they never considered in that way before as well. So real quickly, these are some of the themes that have emerged in the several times that I've done this workshop. So after the small group time, the groups share out to the larger group in the plenary discussion, and this is a very interesting portion of the session. So some of the trends and themes that have emerged are, first of all, disciplinary idiosyncrasies. This could be something like certain disciplines value publishing in journals over monographs or vice versa. What's new and exciting or different ideas about what matters to the field are very different and also come up. The locus of scholarly conversation. This is interesting. This is where scholarly conversation takes place within disciplines. This also involves the place of things like conferences or articles or even social media. There are large shifts taking place in the importance of social media to the scholarly conversation in several disciplines, so this comes out as well. Practitioner and professor. These discussions involve what students are going to go on to do after graduation and how information literacies that they will need differ within those professions according to if they're going to go on to academia, if they're going to be a practitioner, whatever it is they're going to do. So there are different debates that come up there. Authority debates. What counts for evidence in one field can be very different from another, and these constructions of authority vary greatly as well. And the last theme that I included here are reading skills and techniques. So how someone interacts with a text varies greatly across disciplines as well. If you think of the ways that a historian interacts with the text, it's very different from the way a scientist, a biologist, or even a physician would interact with the text. So those are some differences that also come up as themes of our discussion. So if there's time, usually after a long break, participants can return to their disciplinary groups and think about more practical applications. At this point, I ask the groups to select one frame, one information literacy frame that has stood up to them the most or where they see the most potential for thinking about teaching and learning, and to start thinking about identifying common bottlenecks that they see with their students in these areas. So hopefully by this point, they've been able to unearth some of those tacit practices and understandings that relate to those student bottlenecks. And again, I've left out this step in some of the shorter workshops if I don't have that much time. Next steps, so since the goal of this workshop is not for participants to leave with a completely finished set of learning outcomes and activities, but to get them thinking strategically about tacit knowledge, points of need, and possible collaborations, it's helpful to have these next steps set out for the participants for the future. So continuing to bring together those bottlenecks and the expert practices, and then brainstorming ideas for collaboration with librarians. I always make sure to include work with your librarians because they get off on these great ideas, and I'm like, there's a librarian sitting right here with you that could help you think through all of these things as you think about how to make this more accessible to students. So just to summarize, these are the benefits for librarians and information literacy that I see as a result of the workshops. Librarians making use of our expertise within disciplinary contexts. Librarians being positioned to help with more creative collaborations. And the possibility for us to think more creatively about places, ways, and ideas to address information literacy throughout the curriculum. Okay, here are my URLs, and you know what, I'm going to take these and paste them into the chat box because I don't think that you can click on them from the PowerPoint here. I'm going to do that right now. Okay, and that's it for me. Thank you very much.
Okay, so this is Amanda Nickel-Test. I'm going to be taking over now, and I will just wait for, let me see if I can switch presentations. I don't think I can. I'm not sure if there's something that I need to do to pull my presentation up, or if it's already loaded and I'm just missing it. I'll wait for instructions from you, Lois or Amanda, if you have any guidance for me.
Hi, Amanda. This is Ashley.
Hi, Ashley.
Up at the top, you see a tab that says ACRL webinar. And that,
there it is. Thank you so much. Okay, so as I mentioned, my name is, or as I really should say Amanda mentioned, my name is Amanda Nickel-Test. I'm the other Amanda in this webinar. And you'll have to excuse my fonts are a little bit funky. I was trying to fix them, so please excuse if they get a little off kilter. I'm happy to share the original presentation as a PDF, so if anything kind of gets lost in translation. But my name is Amanda Nickel-Test. I'm the e-learning, instructional technology, and education librarian at OU. And today I'm going to talk about using the framework to foster conversations about information literacy instruction. And there are lots of different conversations to be had about the framework. But my presentation is going to focus on one specific kind of conversation. And that is that as the framework changes, what information literacy instruction looks like, a central question, I shouldn't really say the central question, but for me the central question becomes, how can academic librarians be equipped to reframe their instructional practices to address this new way of thinking about information literacy? So Sarah kind of mentioned this, I think, or alluded to this maybe, but there seem to be two different camps about the framework. There are people who view it as something that is very similar to what their instruction has looked like or what the kind of teaching they've been doing in specific disciplines, and the framework is not a big mental shift for them or not a shift in practice for them. And then there's a group for whom the framework represents a complete departure from what they are used to and what they've been doing in their practices. And the truth probably is somewhere in the middle, although I think that sometimes both of the groups, when I've been at conferences or at workshops or in conversation, have been a little bit dismissive of each other. So what I really want to acknowledge are these two different perspectives about the framework and about understanding what the framework represents for information literacy instruction before I dive into how I think we can use the framework to engage in conversation about our information literacy instruction. And I think probably the truth is somewhere in between these two categories, but it's definitely safe to say that for at least for some librarians, the framework has really moved their cheese, and it really represents something they need to wrap their heads around in terms of their own information literacy instruction. I am not ashamed to say that the framework has thrown me for a loop at times, and I know that many of my colleagues feel that way as well. So my conversation that I really want to focus on today is how we can address meeting those people's needs and helping to better conceptualize the framework for our teaching and learning in our own libraries. So what this really means is that for this group of people, how can we help them to integrate the framework more with their relationship with their discipline faculty and in their teaching? And the case that I'm going to make is that to answer this question most effectively, we first need to understand how to apply 3 different approaches to adult learning, namely transformative learning theory, social learning theory, and goal orientation and motivation. I'm going to talk about those a little bit today. And then if we can apply these ideas in a professional learning setting, like in a job-embedded training session or a workshop or even conference offerings, we can have more meaningful learning as a result. And then this learning can result in innovative and effective instruction that considers and addresses the frames in the framework. So I'm going to start by talking about those 3 learning theories, those 3 approaches to adult learning, and how we might apply them in academic libraries or for academic librarians. And then I'll share with you how our library approached learning about the framework and integrating it into our instruction using these different learning theories. So first, let me talk about transformative learning theory, which was originated by Jack Mesereau. And he argued that adults have frames of reference that develop through experience, through reflection, through observation, and through other processes of life. And these frames define our worldview. But these frames are not always accurate, or they're not always current, depending on when we sort of develop these frames of reference. And if they've held true over a period of time, they may need to be modified or changed. So learning then becomes more about recognizing these frames for what they are and that they exist, and transforming them into more accurate or flexible frames we can use going forward. So from Mesereau's perspective, learning is about changing and equipping oneself for more change in the future. So what do we do when we encounter change? And how do we make sure that we are ready to encounter change as we go forward? So a key component of these frames of reference are what Mesereau called habits of mind. And these are the broad, abstract, orienting, habitual ways of thinking, feeling, and acting that are influenced by assumptions we make that then develop into a set of codes. And these codes could be cultural, they could be social, educational, economic, political, psychological. So for instance, and when I say I don't mean me necessarily, but if I teach information literacy by demonstrating how to develop a search strategy, use a database to find a scholarly article, evaluate the usefulness of that resource, and then figure out how to ethically use it in making new research for my specific purpose, whether it's academic or personal. This is a sort of habit of mind I have about information literacy instruction. It's the way information literacy instruction happens, because that's how I've always done it, or that's how I've done it at least for a long period of time. It's become a habit of mine for me without even thinking about it. So the way that one thinks about instruction and teaching becomes ingrained in one's mind to a point where we don't even consider where it comes from or whether it's grounded in the current reality of the situation, either in what an instructor represents they need, or what students need, or what we as experts in information literacy know that students need today in a very, a society where information literacy is really critical. So Mesereau says that in order to change our habits of mind and transform our frames of reference, we go through 10 phases. So first something happens that throws us off. He calls this the disorienting dilemma. And in our case, and this, if we're looking at transformative learning in the context of the framework, that would be that the framework is released. So what do we do? But once this dilemma has then occurred, individual learners engage in self-examination, which includes feeling shame or guilt. So again, if we look at this idea through the lens of the framework, librarians have looked inward. So is my teaching not good enough? Am I not doing enough? Have I not reached out to my faculty enough? Am I not preparing learners? And I just want to say, as an aside, that I think that us as librarians, we are often very, very self-critical and apt to feel like we're not doing enough when we're literally not doing, we couldn't literally do any more. So I don't want to sound like I'm criticizing librarians or that we need to feel this guilt or shame. I think this is something that happens across transformative learning with lots of groups, but I don't think that librarians should feel like they really need to feel lots of shame and guilt about this. But this is just a phase in the process that then from there, from this self-examination that we undergo, we can then critically assess our own assumptions that relate to the disorienting dilemma that has occurred. So in the case of the framework, the questions become, what do I really think information literacy means? What is it all about me in the 21st century, and am I reflecting this in my teaching? So what are my assumptions about what I need to be doing? And then from there, the learner can move to acknowledging that change can happen because others have done it before them, and others are in the process of changing too. So the sense of I'm not the first, or in this situation, the only librarian who's going through these kind of growing pains or needing to change to have my teaching reflect different ideas or different conceptions of information literacy today. So once this acknowledgement of change occurs, then the learner can begin to explore how they can make this transformation happen. And this involves figuring out the roles they can take on, the relationships they can build, and the actions they might take. So for instance, librarians might begin to explore the kind of action they can take within their institution to build their own knowledge. So I know at our institution, actually, we have several faculty members who are talking a lot about threshold concepts. So that might be, at our institution, that might be a way for us to advance our knowledge of what that really means for us in our teaching. They also might seek out professional learning, either formal or informal, around the framework, or even trying to build relationships with others who could help them to confront and adapt their frames of reference and their habits of mind. And then the next 5 steps is really where the action happens. So a course of action is chartered then. So this is when librarians thought about what they could do, now they're actually going to do it. And then by doing it, they're able to grasp the necessary knowledge and skills. So then once they have those knowledge and skills, they are able to then try it out in different ways. So for the framework, this might mean trying out different instructional strategies, talking about them with your colleagues or piloting them in a class, or even observing someone else pilot them in a classroom so you can kind of see firsthand, okay, how can I integrate this frame into my teaching? Next, then, the learner renegotiates the existing relationships that they have and negotiates new relationships around their new frames of reference and their habits of mind. So this is, I think, where a key piece of the framework comes in, and that's those relationships we have with the discipline faculty. I think that is a big stumbling block for people with the framework. So rather than just doing a traditional maybe point and click kind of a lesson, we push beyond that into what information literacy means for that specific discipline and for the students. We begin to explore threshold concepts and the information literacy frames in fuller ways. But this is really tough and really scary. And I will give a little sneak preview before I talk about our processes. I don't know that many of us are quite there yet, at least all the way. But so we really have to figure out, what does the framework mean to my relationships with my instructional colleagues in the library? What does it mean for my relationships with my faculty, and how can it shape or reshape those relationships? But once that step has been accomplished or undertaken, the learner's frame of reference, which has been changed through this process, and their habits of mind are reintegrated into their life. So for us, then, the goal is that eventually the framework becomes implicit in how we think about our teaching and implicit in how we think about information literacy instruction. So the next learning theory that I want to discuss is social learning theory, which really originates with Albert Bandura. And it really is not centered on adults. It was more about children learning from other children and learning how to be members of a society. But I think it can be applied to adult learning theory or adult learning situations really in interesting ways. So it involves modeling, it involves observing, and imitation. So learning by watching others or engaging in firsthand experiences. So if we think about how this learning theory could be applied, especially through the lens of transformative learning theory, we can see several applications that directly impact how we can grapple with the framework in our teaching. So we can have conversations with others who are on the other side of that transformative process, or who are farther along, at least, in the process than we are, asking them, what have they done? What were their stumbling blocks? What issues did they encounter? How did they surmount those issues? What have they learned? What would they recommend that we try, or maybe not recommend that we try? How can we learn from others just through using them as a model? Also, what can we do in terms of observation to try and understand what others are doing as they work through their own transformative learning process? So, as I mentioned before, trying out the knowledge that you've acquired might involve piloting. So this might mean that you observe someone else who pilots a lesson, or have someone observe you as you pilot a lesson that incorporates some of the framework ideas, and get feedback in a safe, sort of lower stress way, so you can really work on how you're going to develop those skills or those knowledges or those competencies in your own instruction. We can also create groups that commit to working through the framework together, so communities of learners who are grappling with their frames of reference and their habits of mind as a whole, even though those might be a little bit different, and who are working to transform these so that they can incorporate the ideas into the framework we're going to be doing this together. So this is another way that we could imitate each other, use modeling to take advantage of modeling in groups. And I'll talk more about one way that we did that in my library in a little bit. So the last learning concept that I want to discuss is the idea of learners' goal orientation or motivation, which I think can kind of be grouped together because both of these notions get at the why and how of people's behavior. So if we want to learn about the framework in our teaching, why do we want to do this? What will this accomplish for us? What are our goals and what drives us toward achieving these goals? That's sort of the central question around goal orientation and motivation. So if we're considering what it means in terms of conversations around the framework, that means that we need to acknowledge that different people will approach the framework and do approach the framework with different motivations or with different end goals in mind. So if we can think about why people are, or the ways in which people are approaching the framework for their own practices and their own teaching, we can really consider the incentives that people might want in learning new things, or the incentives that we could offer or provide or build into learning experiences that would help them to engage in the process. So at sort of a higher level versions of incentives, there are fiscal incentives that might address some librarians' goal orientations. So this might mean that a stipend is offered for participating in some sort of learning program or learning engagement, or perhaps there's an external learning activity around the framework's ideas that is paid for. For instance, I know that LOEX had a fall focus conference here in Michigan in Ypsilanti in 2015 about the framework's ideas. So that would be maybe a fiscal incentive if you're trying to get somebody kind of on board and more interested in integrating the framework ideas in different ways. Also, you could look at things like a change in workload. That could serve as an incentive for others who are looking to integrate the framework. So at my institution, we have liaison responsibilities, but we also help to cover our research help desk, and we teach sort of like the intro to library sections for our writing program, our first year writing program. And so changing workload might mean something as simple as reducing the hours on the desk or reducing the number of those first year writing classes that you have to teach in exchange for focused work on the framework. But I think I really want to make sure I say that I am in a complete non-supervisory role, so that those are not things that I could at all do if I was trying to get people on board with the framework. The next two ideas I think are a little bit more feasible across the board, and we shouldn't discount them because I think often fiscal and workload incentives might be fickle, whereas things like social and interpersonal incentives are easier to employ and maybe have as good or better of an outcome. So a social incentive might mean that when you hold a training or you hold a workshop, you have food. Something as simple as that, which I have employed many, many times. And then interpersonally, if you have a colleague, who is interested in engaging with other people around the ideas in the framework, having a group workshop or offering time for group discussion on these ideas might be an incentive enough to participate rather than operating in silos. So I think when we think about goal orientation and motivation, the first thing to really think about is what are your goals around the framework and what would provide incentive for you to participate in learning more about this topic. And then think about the colleagues that who you know really well. And I bet you can identify the incentives that would work for them. So from these understandings, we can think more consciously about how we can address motivation and how we can address individual goal orientation when we think about adopting the framework. So now what I'm going to sort of shift over to is, since we have a basis in these learning theories, I want to share how we put them into action around the framework at Oakland University Library. So I'm in Rochester. I know people think they hear Oakland, they think, California. No such luck. But at Oakland University in Rochester, I created targeted faculty learning communities to help my colleagues consider the framework in their teaching. And these structures also helped us to address transformative learning theory, social learning theory, and goal orientation and motivation. So the first thing, though, that I want to talk about is I want to sort of have a baseline understanding of learning communities, because that's the structure that we use. And this is a well-developed model for faculty development, professional learning around issues of teaching and learning. And so I just want to share what the scholarship says about learning communities. First of all, they are relatively small. They have 8 to 10 individuals, and they are either based around a cohort of people, so for instance, a particular group like new faculty at your university, or a specific topic. They also have a clear sense of membership, and they have a common set of goals for their learning, for what they're seeking to accomplish. And they have opportunities for frequent interaction. They also focus generally on issues that relate to the scholarship of teaching and learning, and technology is used to facilitate learning, but also to as a component of learning. And so I also want to mention, before we move on to what we did in our faculty learning communities, when I say faculty, our librarians here at Oakland University are faculty. So this was just a cohort-based learning community with just library faculty in it. So when I say faculty, I don't necessarily mean discipline faculty. I just mean us librarians here as we tried to grapple with the ideas in the framework. So in the 2014-2015 academic year, we had 2 learning communities that were built around the framework. We had one in the fall of 2014 and one in the winter semester of 2015. But I want to also make sure that you know that we had a year-long learning community in 2013-14 around instructional design and using technology in teaching. So we were really familiar with this structure and with this model, which I think allowed us to jump into it really easily. So in these learning communities, these semester-long learning communities, we aimed to help us figure out how we could integrate the new information literacy frames into our teaching. And in the fall, we did this in groups of 3, small groups, and in the winter, we did this as a large group. And our groups were about 9 people each go around. So in the fall, we had 3 groups of 3, and then in the winter, we just had a group of 9. We met monthly, either in person or virtually via WebEx, and we had shared goals in our community where in the fall, we aimed to create online learning objects in our small groups that addressed a single information literacy frame that was generic enough that many people could use it in their teaching, or a student could even access it from our library website or tutorials repository. And then in the winter, we worked to develop strategies for integrating the frames into our teaching practices across the library. So as I mentioned, we have a first-year instruction program through our required first-year writing course that we all teach. We also have liaison areas, and then we have an online credit-bearing course. So we thought about how we could integrate the different framework ideas into each of those different teaching areas. And so we integrated the learning theories that I talked about into our learning communities in several ways. So first, we worked through the phases of the transformative learning process together with intention. So we confronted the challenge ahead of us. We considered our own implicit assumptions, whether they were different across the board or the same in some cases. And then we challenged those assumptions through this learning community model. And it doesn't mean, of course, that we got all the way through that transformative learning process. I think that most people are still working on acquiring the skills and the knowledge that we really need to integrate the frames more fully into our teaching. And some people are trying those out, but different people are at different phases. The learning community also was obviously an instance of an application of social learning theory, because we worked together, we observed each other, we modeled different behaviors for each other. We really were able to show and observe the different behaviors that we thought were necessary in our teaching if we were really going to integrate the framework ideas into our different instructional roles. And then finally, the learning community structure had goal orientation and motivation integrated into its very core. So it engaged motivation by making professional learning grounded in people's real world needs, so very situationally located in people's job responsibilities. But as I was designing it, I also tried to consider what my colleagues' goals were more broadly. So we had opportunities for interpersonal interaction, for collaboration, and then also, like I said, I always had food, so that helped. But we made, really the main focus here was to make the learning community job focused and relevant to work. So that was an incentive to get people in the door, that they could have something they could use in their teaching or try in their teaching or show to a faculty member with whom they worked. So by integrating these learning theory ideas into our learning community iterations in the fall and the winter versions, the whole became greater than the sum of the parts, and we were able to, I think, build a better understanding about the framework than if we had just worked alone or we had worked in a learning community without considering those adult learning theories. So I just want to revisit this conceptual framework from the beginning of the presentation, where I said that if we could understand how to apply these 3 different approaches to adult learning theory, we could then apply those in professional learning settings, like job-embedded trainings or conference offerings. We could have more meaningful learning as a result of those things, which could then in turn lead to more innovative and effective instruction that considered and addressed the framework. But so in our case, what we did is we applied these 3 different learning theories: transformative learning theory, social learning theory, and goal orientation and motivation within the structure of a faculty learning community that was focused on the framework, which then in turn resulted in more meaningful professional learning, which led to a more in-depth consideration of the framework and a preliminary implementation of it across our different instructional programs. And it's very preliminary. It's not, we are certainly not at a place where we are integrating at a really high level yet. But so then the next logical step would be, and Sarah talked about this as she talked about working with discipline-specific faculty, is that if we can consider these learning theories with academic librarians around the framework and consider how these information literacy frames can be taught and assessed from our own perspectives, we can see greater connections between these frames and the concepts that exist in specific disciplines. So integrating the ideas of the framework then into a discipline's essential knowledges or threshold concepts could in turn result in greater integration of information literacy knowledge and within the discipline, so more partnership between librarians and discipline faculty, or even just graduating more prepared students for 21st century work. So if you are interested in our work that we did at Oakland University Libraries, I just want to share 2 references with you. I have other references that I'll share. But I published an article recently on both the theory side and the practical side of this process. But at this point, I'll share my references with you because I know this was kind of a content-based presentation, so I'll share where you can find more about these different topics of transformative learning theory and social learning theory and goal orientation and motivation. But at that point, I'm all done, and I'm happy to turn it over to questions.
Hi, Amanda. This is Ashley. It looks like you have a question about how long you've met each month.
Yes, I see that. Thank you, Juliet. So we met just for about an hour every month. And Fridays are sort of our meeting days. So we have meetings the first 3 Friday mornings of every month. And so the fourth Friday very easily became we just had one more meeting, and it was kind of like automatic on people's calendars. So we alternated between a face-to-face meeting and a virtual meeting via WebEx. Yes, and I will post, I will copy my article citations and also the citations for the different articles that I cited throughout the presentation. I will copy those into the chat box so you can get to them all. I see that was a question as well.
Amanda, another question was, when do you have the workshops as far as within the year?
It looks like that was a question actually for Sarah, but we had them.
Oh, I'm sorry.
No, that's okay. I can answer. We just had them monthly on the 4th Friday of every month. But if I'm interested in when Sarah held her workshops as well, so I'm glad someone asked that. I'll mute my mic and let her answer.
Yeah, so our workshop, we actually did it through the one here at Michigan State. We did through our Office of Faculty and Organizational Development, which is our teaching and learning center here. And each spring, the week after graduation, they have something called the Spring Institute. And it's the week after classes are done or after graduation, and the faculty are still, their contracts run through the 15th of May. So during that last week, they have a Spring Institute with very focused workshops. And we were able to hold it during one of those days. I also just last week gave a version of the workshop at Calvin College here in Michigan, and it was also about the same time of the year for them. They were actually working with, they have a small grant that, talking about incentives like Amanda was mentioning there, they have a grant for certain disciplinary faculty to work with librarians to develop some materials regarding writing across the curriculum. So I was able to present this workshop as part of their writing across the curriculum project.
There are a handful of questions in the box below the citation. So.
Okay. It looks like, I'm wondering, Cindy, it looks like your question is for me about the modules that the small groups created. So what we did was, in the last 3 or 4 years, we have redone our online tutorials repository, how we present freestanding online content to students. So in creating sort of generic modules, or it was really more like generic online learning content, whether it was like a video or whether it was an infographic or something students could click through, it was really designed, or we as a group agreed that we were going to house that content in our online tutorials repository, which is located on our webpage, which has a search bar, and it's located right on our library homepage. So we were sort of able to keep track of it in that way. In terms of like getting people time to work themselves out, I think like any project, people lost steam as the holidays approached, which was why kind of we kept it to a semester long in that case, and we wanted them to be very simple. So I think what I'm hopeful is that doing that in small groups help people to think about how they could do it really specifically for their own liaison areas, because everyone has such different liaison areas. And we talked a lot about the struggle that we had in how can we really make this really generic without oversimplifying it or completely losing an audience. But yeah, so I don't know if that really answers your question, but we did kind of keep track of them just because they were located on our websites. But we thought really that if we could have a basic resource, we could then build from it. But I don't know that many people have really built from it in the ensuing months. So, but I think your idea of research roadmaps, that maybe is a good idea. I think that might be something that we could even revisit. And then it looks like there's a question for me about disciplinary faculty recruited. We did not recruit disciplinary faculty. It was just library faculty. So it was just us. It was just internal because we really needed to grapple with the concepts ourselves because it was so different for us as an institution from what we were doing. So.
As far as how we recruited disciplinary faculty, in the case of Michigan State, we didn't have that many disciplinary faculty participate. We still find, when I work with the teaching and learning office here, we find that stuff that has information literacy, the words information literacy in the description of the title, people's interests get piqued, but not a lot of people actually commit to coming. And so it's hard to get people to get on board unless they already know something a little bit about it. And as far as the situation that I just did, those librarians were already, or those disciplinary faculty and librarians were already on board with a different program of doing writing across the disciplines. So we recruited from an already existing pool.
Cindy, also, if I answer your question, I'm not sure if this is one Sarah wants to answer too, about whether we partner with university writing centers. The writing center is actually in the library, but we don't have a big partnership with them other than that and just being friendly in our work environment. But we have a Department of Writing and Rhetoric that we work with in our first year instruction program. And I know our coordinator of instruction here at the library is working with the chair of that department and several faculty members on sort of crosswalking or connecting at least the information literacy frames and their new sets of standards or how they're thinking about their teaching. So I think that's a similar connection to a writing center maybe, but it's a powerful one that can be made, and it's sort of like I think a natural synergy that can happen.
Yeah, here at Michigan State, we have been every year we try harder and harder to get something going with our writing center, and it's notoriously difficult here to get something going with them. I don't know if it sounds like maybe at Amanda's institution they're having a similar problem, but yeah, the turnover, the staff turnover is very high with the writing center. Our director turnover is sometimes high, and I think it's just, I'd love to work with the writing center. It's just kind of getting your hooks in the right person who takes the bait, I think, is kind of a crass way of putting it, but yeah, we've had some difficulty in getting anything meaningful going with the writing center. Always very friendly, always like, oh yeah, we'd love to work with you, and then not much more. So again, I think that varies by institution as well.
And it looks like Charlie had a question about what library schools could do to support librarians in the integration of the framework into instruction. That's a very good question. I can just give you my opinion, and I'm several years at a library school now, so it might be different. But I know that when I was in library school, I think there was so much on my plate as a student that I didn't come out necessarily equipped to engage in instruction. So I think greater opportunities for that, more opportunities, whether it's in the classroom or whether it's through conferences or different kind of other external professional learning opportunities to kind of learn about instructional approaches and learning about what it means to really be an instructional librarian, because many academic librarians are going to be doing that, if not most. And I think that's also a prime time to really think about what are the key concepts in this discipline that I'm studying. I think maybe if you can get people in library school to think about the frames more, and you get them thinking about instruction, maybe that can be married a little bit more easily because their minds are fresh with all this theoretical thinking about what librarianship is and what information science is. So that might be something to do. I don't know, though. That's sort of just off the top of my head.
This is interesting. We've actually had several interviews here at MSU lately, and several of the interview presentations have been students that are just recent graduates or getting ready to graduate from library school, and it's been really interesting to hear them. Most of them have mentioned the framework, and it's been really interesting to hear. You can almost hear them grappling with it in their presentations as far as thinking about what traditional instruction looks like and what this might look like. And a lot of them also haven't had that much experience with instruction yet. I think the framework makes a lot of sense to those of us who have had a lot more experience in instruction, because it gives us, our experience kind of gives us something to hold on to. So it's interesting, but yeah, I know that in the library schools that our candidates came from, they're definitely talking about it, which was really encouraging. But it was also just really fascinating to hear. I think the students are also grappling with what the framework really means to them and what it will mean in the future for them as professional librarians. So again, I'm not sure as far as how it should be integrated in the library school. I'm not sure practically, but I think that it's great that it's being discussed, and it's making a lot of people think, which is good. Okay, I see another question here. In our small, this is a question from Angie here, where I was able to have meaningful disciplinary discussions and workshops if I don't have representation from a variety of disciplinary faculty. I would think at least when I've recently done these questions in a group of 6 librarians. We also have a community of practice here, similar to what Amanda was talking about. And the librarians all had very different disciplinary subject areas. We had business, health sciences, special collections, chemistry, and one other, I can't remember. And so that made for an interesting discussion. But I think it's nice to have a couple disciplines represented, but if everyone was from the same discipline, these questions are still really applicable. You might not have the kind of foils or complements from the other disciplines, but it's nice to be able to have more in-depth conversations about one that you're all familiar with.
And Heidi, I saw that you had a question about whether all of our instruction librarians participated. Excuse me. We didn't have everybody participate. It was completely optional. The other thing that I didn't actually mention about learning communities generally, at the institutional level, they are normally supported monetarily. And this was just an informal, what Sarah called, I think at Michigan State, it's called the community of practice. It was probably more like that. It was very informal in terms of it was, people could come as they wanted, if it was applicable to them, or choose not to, because it was just something that was in response to needs that people expressed and that I saw in my role in terms of equipping people with instructional design skills and education, instructional technology kinds of skills. So we had a group of 9, like I mentioned. It wasn't necessarily the same group, but it was optional for people. So we really had people who were interested in being there rather than people who were dragged, which was nice.
All right, are there any more questions? The presentation will be posted on the instruction section, management and leadership committee website in a few days once it is ready, so you can look for it there. We hope to have a third presentation as part of this series in July or August. We had to cancel one due to some illness, I believe. So look for that one as it comes up. Thanks to all of you for attending this session, and thanks to the presenters, and again to Alois for helping us out and being great as always. Are there any other questions or comments before we all sign off? All right, if not, thank you all again.